Dr. Robert Hampson. You will hear me occasionally refer to him as speaker. I'll try to remember to say Rob, but which comes to how did you pick up the nickname speaker?
It was never meant to be a name. It was a signature line.
Oh, okay.
Online. Because of some of the research that I was doing, I was the speaker to lab animals. And the entire signature line was speaker to lab animals, mind reader to Rattus norvegicus, Macaca mulatta, and the murine at the other end of the bar, which is to say rats, monkeys, and mice. And we were doing recordings in my research that would give us a prediction of what the animal would do. And so I had some online friends in use groups and bulletin boards that said, "So you're like a mind reader." And I said, "Well, not exactly. More of a speaker to lab animals." And that's where it came from. And then first time I went to LibertyCon, by the end of the convention, it had been shortened from speaker to lab animals to just speaker. And it kind of stuck.
Okay. Well, for those in the audience who haven't figured it out, Robert Hampson is a pretty smart guy. But first, I forget myself. The name of the show is The Next Chapter. Biz TV is gracious enough to let me record this show, and they put it up on their YouTube channel and their podcast, and stations maybe in Peoria or Minot, North Dakota might run it in the middle of the night. But the name of the show is The Next Chapter. Talk about all things related to the written word, interview authors, author scientists. There have been publishers, editors, a little bit everything. I'm Fred Hughes. I write military science fiction, and they graciously let me do this podcast. So sitting next to me, I've already introduced him, Robert Hampson, educator, scientist, author, speaker to lab animals. And we'll get to it in one of the later segments, but we're going to talk about the $6 Million Man, because this is the guy for a long time that worked for the government to invent that. And sort of on the fringe is still working on that. So we'll talk about that. But first, I want to give Rob the opportunity to talk about his books, especially you've got one that's coming out, or it just came out.
I do. My publisher jokes that I write hard science fiction, and even writing zombie apocalypse, I wrote hard science fiction. So coming out next April 1st, 2025, Across an Ocean of Stars is the 14th entry in John Ringo's Black Tide Rising series. And there's a little bit of a story as to how I came to write a novel in Black Tide Rising. And it goes back to when John came up with the idea of doing a zombie apocalypse. And he sent me an email and called me up, and we spent about 2.5 hours on a video conference call one night. Usually, most of it involved John giggling as we designed the zombie virus. And we designed a distribution system, what the consequences would be, because he wanted something that wasn't undead. He didn't want mystical zombies. He wanted science zombies. And so I was one of his original readers, subject matter expert and consultant, and also got a chance to write some short stories. And I wrote a short story that turned into a novel. So that's, I've just actually turned in the finished version after edits and rewrites and the publisher's comments on it. That's now considered finished and into production. I just turned that in 2 weeks ago.
Outstanding. So Tony's got all that and is ready to push it. And I'm talking about Tony Weisskopf, the grand poobah of Baen Books. And so how did you get started as a traditionally published author?
The funny part of it is I didn't start off to be a fiction author. I was contacted by a number of authors, and mostly through the Baines Bar um, bulletin board group. And authors would say, "Hey, I need a science trick, basically," and I'm not belittling it. It's a science trick. We're coming up with MacGuffins here.
Oh, so hand wavy him?
Hand waving them, but it's got to look real. And so I would respond. And after a while, Bain started putting fiction and nonfiction on a monthly basis on the website. And I was asked to write some nonfiction articles for them. And I was then starting to write some short stories. And I had a few short stories published, and a number of those were in Bain Books. And then Tony Daniel, who was one of the editors at Bain, turned to me one night and says, "Okay, when are you sending me something?" And I started talking about, what are you working on right now? He said, "No, when are you sending me a story?" And that's when I said, "Well, I've always wanted to do a retelling of the $6 Million Man." And so I wrote that and I sent it, and that was how I ended up. But I came at it backwards because I wasn't writing fiction. I was writing nonfiction.
Well, I was going to say, as a high level college professor, and not just professor, people think of guy in a three-piece suit standing in front of a bunch of students. This was a guy that wore a lab coat. Yeah, this is a guy who wore a lab coat, back doing serious research. So, but obviously a lot of technical papers and everything else. So, writing wasn't anything new to you. It just making it up.
Well, at one point, comparing notes with a fiction author, he was talking about how many books and how many words. And I tallied up the grants I had written and the papers I'd written. And he was saying that he probably had about 1.5 million words in print. And I said, I probably got about 2 million. And he looked at me and he says, "Yes, Rob. And knowing what you do, it's every bit as much fiction as what I write." And
well, you had probably had 1 million in just bibliography.
It's not so much in the bibliography, but it was easily 1 million in the grant proposals. But it's also a very, very different mindset. If I have to be writing science, if I have to write a grant, if I have to write a paper, I cannot then shift gears, put that down, and write a short story or write science fiction. I have to clear out all of the science I have to write, give myself a week at least.
That's an interesting concept, because I know a lot of people, and John Ringo's one of them, that they write multiple things at the same time. He'll write this story in the morning and then he'll turn around and write this story in the afternoon. Jonathan Mayberry's the same way. He'll write a a Joe Ledger, 2, 3, 4,000 words in the morning, and then he'll turn around and write, a horror story or a sci-fi book in the afternoon. And I'm going, "Oh, I couldn't do that." I mean, keeping the story straight is, keeping one story straight is hard enough. And it sounds like you're like me, and I need total focus on.
Well, my wife can attest to the fact that.
Can you?
Yes, she's in the audience right now. She can attest to the fact that when I'm writing, I'm oblivious. And it doesn't matter what I'm writing. If I'm deep into it, I'm oblivious. But I have to clear a space between the science and the fiction. But what I do find is that if I'm ever blocked on one type of story or one particular story, I can, if it's my fiction writing space, I can shift to another story and write pieces of it. And I have been known to write pieces, but I've also got an awful lot of pieces sitting on the disk of my computer that I haven't gotten back to finish yet.
All those do.
Yeah.
Either get tired of it or run out of inspiration or whatever it is. So, but I cut you off before we really finished talking about the zombie apocalypse story here. And I want you, and when my producer gets all this film information, she'll lay in some background and will get a picture of the cover of your book and she'll have it displayed, probably between us, like right here. But describe it to the audience. It's rather a unique picture.
Oh,
It's
the
it's
picture
it's
is
you
fun.
it's you in a Hawaiian shirt. Um,
I don't know that it's me because it's the bad guy. So only if it's self-insert with me as the villain. But what it is it's the story of what happens in Hawaii when the zombie apocalypse comes. And this is the backstory of Black Tide Rising is that somewhere between 1 and 10% of humanity survives. About half of humanity dies to the initial disease, and most of the rest of the half turns into rage zombies.
so we're back with Robert Hampson, and he's talking about his Black Tide Rising book that he just wrote in John Ringo's universe, and his Hawaiian zombie bad guy surfing, catching, hanging 10 as he's trying to basically overrun Hawaii.
Right. So I traveled to Hawaii quite a bit, and I like the idea of what would the Hawaiian people do, because the Polynesian culture is one of self-sufficiency and exploration. So I said, very likely there would be a reversion to this. So I wrote the story from the point of view of the people who would be the survivors in Hawaii, and how do they put their community back together? There turns out to be a bad guy, and the bad guy seems to have some power over the zombies. And the funny part of this is that with the basic description of zombie apocalypse in Hawaii, the cover artist Kurt Miller came up with this really incredible cover art of maybe he's a zombie or maybe he's just really badly weathered, and he's got sun-bleached hair and patchy skin, and he's wearing an old blue aloha shirt with pink flowers and a wilted lei and board shorts. And yes, the cover does look like he's hanging 10 in the surf. And I saw the cover and I said, I have a character that all I have to do is describe him as wearing that shirt, because he's the bad guy and he's driving the zombies. He's influencing them. He's directing them at our protagonists. And so the cover art is a character. And while he's not a zombie by the end of the book, he certainly looks like one. So he looks just like the character on the cover. I loved it. It was a great way to tie it all together.
And that's coming out from Bain tentatively April of next year.
Release date is April 1 in 2025.
And I think we already mentioned it. Tony Weisskopf, the editor at Bain, already has the book. And so basically it's ready to go. They're just getting ready to print copies of it so it can go into your local Barnes and Noble, or it can go to, or you can get it on Bain online, or you'll actually be able to pick it up on Amazon. But that's not the only thing you can read of Roberts in those locations. Tell us about the rest of your stuff, the books.
Well, I think we're going to hold off on me talking more about the moon in the desert for a bit.
Moon in the desert will be next segment, because that sort of is our $6 million man segment that we're going to do.
But let me tell you about a couple of my other pieces. From Bain, I've actually been co-editor on 2 anthologies. And those anthologies are actually really kind of special. I am part of the advisory board for a group called the Interstellar Research Group. And it is a group of engineers and scientists, as well as the dreamers, who are going to help us get to the stars. And we have conferences every couple of years in which we look at the great tech, but we also try to influence the writers, the students, to go into these fields. We had a conference one year, a a working track is what we called it, where we get together and discuss, and we called it Homo Stellaris, the people of the stars. What would it take? What do humans have to become for us to become a truly interstellar species? Coming out of that, we put together, Les Johnson and I put together an anthology that is about 2/3 short stories, fiction, and 1/3 nonfiction on that same topic of what will humanity become as we go to the stars. So the book's name is Stellaris, People of the Stars, and it's an anthology and it's on this general theme. The other one is an anthology called The Founder Effect. And in The Founder Effect, this is a shared world where my sister Sandra Medlock and I proposed a world that is an interstellar colony, humanity's first interstellar colony. And we asked the question is, how will the actions of the founders become the myths and legends of the future colony?
Because they've lost that.
Because they've lost that. And as is very common in these types of settings, a colony is very likely to go through what we call a colony restriction event. And the survivors of a colony restriction event, this could be a disease, this could be a natural disaster, this could be a failure of some element of their political structure, their community structure. And what survives that restriction in biology is called the founder effect. And so only the survivors' genes end up in the later generations. In this case, we said only the legends of those founders are all that we really have to know what's going on. So this is a great collection of short stories by other authors, but then I created a linking story through what I call my Encyclopedia Galactica entries, to steal a line from Asimov's Foundation. But this is essentially how will these ordinary as well as heroic events be recorded by posterity. And it was a lot of fun. I'm very proud of that volume, and it continues to be well spoken of.
Well, you've also written for My Boss.
Yes. Yes.
So that's a little, I don't want to say it's necessarily out of your wheelhouse, but I wouldn't necessarily have expected when I went back and was researching for this, everything that you've been, and I'm going, well, gee, I didn't know Rob had written a 4HU book.
It's actually very funny that I would write military science fiction, not having a military background. But I've been military adjacent for most of my life. I grew up in San Antonio, which is a military town. My scoutmasters were all military, some current duty, some retired. So it's something I grew up with. But I was given an opportunity to write about the Rogel, which are a species of intelligent octopi. And they are also the surgeons of the Four Horsemen universe. And this is where the phrase thingy and the brainy came from, because they create the brain-computer interfaces that are used throughout the 4HU, and they implant the thingy in your brainy so that you can communicate with the armor suits and everything else, that the mechs and every other computer components. And I wrote a couple of short stories. Those, Chris Kennedy gave me the opportunity to expand that into a novel. And when I started plotting out the novel, I realized it needed to cover 5 characters, and I wanted more voices than just mine. So Chris wrote one of those characters, one of the Rogel characters. I wrote the first one, then of the next generation, the next tier. He wrote one, Sandra Medlock. My sister wrote one. I wrote the third of that generation, and then I wrote the final, the linking it all together. And we've had 2 more books that followed that.
When we come back from this break, we're going to go to the next segment and talk about the $6 Million Man. And this is the guy that helped invent. So we're back from the break. Rob Hansen just got finished telling us about the books he's written, except for one series. So, $6 Million Man, and your equivalent, your literary equivalent of the $6 Million Man. Tell us about that and where it came from and how real or how possible is it?
So there's a little bit of history that I often talk about. My research, scientific training, and education is in the field of physiology and pharmacology. And I started to concentrate on a field called neuroscience. And neuroscience is basically, how does the brain work? How do we fix it when it breaks? But I was inspired by the TV show, The $6 Million Man. So I'm showing my age a little bit because I did watch it first run. And
waited for the next week.
And waited for the very next week. You had to wait a week, and if there was a cliffhanger, you had to wait 3-4 months, right, for the next one. And I thought this was great, and I wanted to study bionics. And I got a degree in biology with a minor in chemistry, and was going to go to med school because I wanted to be a neurosurgeon, and I was going to do all of these wonderful things. And along the way, I got very interested in research. I went off to do a master's, and I found a laboratory that was doing prosthetics research. And I thought, oh, this is great. This is perfect. The year was 1979. Bionics did not exist. Prosthetics meant, what new alloy are we going to create for making pins and plates and the original work on knee replacement, artificial knees? So the field did not exist. I went on to study physiology. It's fascinating field, and I've actually come back to it in my current job. And with the neuroscience, along the way, we started looking at how to repair broken memory. And we started with rodent research and primate research and into human research, where we're trying to decipher what's the difference between the brain signals when memory is working well and when memory is not working well, and how could we go in and make a correction to allow memory to work better? A lot of this work was funded by DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. And it's basically, in their mission statement, we fund science fiction. The whole idea is that we are creating strategic surprise. Surprise is something that's supposed to happen to the other guy. It should never happen to your side. And so if we can create something so technologically advanced and outrageous that it creates surprise, one of those things would be, could we take a person who's been badly injured and restore them to function and maybe just a little bit better than what they were before? That would create strategic surprise. So there was a program at DARPA called Revolutionizing Prosthetics. I was not actually a part of that program, but my program manager created it. So we would have meetings that they would call neurotech, because everything was about how this interfaces with the brain. And around 2019, I was sitting in a meeting, and we had a person who had an implant in the retina of the eye, restoring vision when he was blinded. We had another person who had lost a limb to an accident, and he had a titanium upper arm bone, a magnetic connection, and a fully articulated brain powered and operated artificial hand. He had a bionic hand. We had several other instances of this wonderful tech that we would now call bionics. And I realized, sitting there from 1979, when the field of bionics didn't exist, to 2019, I was sitting in the room with all the people who created it. And that actually inspired me.
Including yourself?
Minor parts. But that gave me the idea, I need to write this. When Martin Caidin wrote Cyborg, the original novel that $6 Million Man was based on, it was the Cold War. Mm-hmm. So Steve Austin was a spy. And in some instances, he was an assassin. There was also, Caden was a little bit cagey in what the capabilities of Steve Austin would be, his bionic man. But also with the TV show, we saw him lifting up cars. We saw him running 60 miles an hour. The human body couldn't tolerate that. It doesn't matter if the bionics would do it. Every part that's biological couldn't do that. And I said, okay, we're gonna make this a little bit better, because everybody so far that has gotten any of these bionic parts as part of these programs has been a volunteer. So I wanted to create a military man, a flight surgeon who is a volunteer, badly injured. He wants to be rebuilt because he wants to go back to do his job. And also a few things such as trying to make sure that everything was biologically plausible. No, he's not running 60 miles an hour. Fastest human runs can sprint in the 20-mile-an-hour range, just a little bit better than 20 miles an hour. So what if our guy, instead of having that as his sprint speed, that's his actual marathon running speed, 20 miles an hour, 19 miles an hour? That would be superhuman. Biking 40 miles an hour, swimming. Oh, well, he doesn't swim very well. And that's actually in the book. So The Moon in the Desert is my telling of the $6 Million Man. By the way, he does a lot of his stuff back in Hawaii. There's a common thread here. Mm-hmm. It's the Hawaiian shirts given away. But he actually pits himself against the Iron Man course and is extremely disappointed when he can't swim a record time. Well, he's denser than he was, and he doesn't float, but he also has spent all of his time inland, landlocked, and not swimming. So he gets well, what did you expect? You haven't been swimming in a year. But there's also a side character who's his rehabilitation psychiatrist that allows me to tell the story of the rehabilitation. And what I have gotten from a lot of the readers and reader reviews, including one of my former DARPA program managers, is that what they really like is he's a human character. He's not superhuman. He just wants to go back to work. And we actually get to see the struggle, because it is not easy.
Now, we were talking earlier offline, actually, while we were eating lunch together. And you mentioned that you'd interviewed a lot of different people who would have been prospective volunteers and there was a common thread amongst them.
That's right. The common thread is, I just want to go back to doing what I used to do. I want to brush my own teeth. I want to brush my own hair. There are, some other cruder comments that could be made, which I will save. But
after hours,
they essentially want to be able to do self-care, and they want to go back to doing their job. So so my common thread for the story is, this is just a guy who wants to go back and do his job.
And I think even in the original, not necessarily in the TV series, but even in the original series, the original books, that was the common thread with Steve Austin. And even in the TV show at the end, he was tired of being being trotted out as a show pony and just wanted to go back to being, the guy he was before he crash landed.
Right. He was. He wanted to go back to a normal life. And as a celebrity superhero, that wasn't possible. That wasn't an option for him.
So how many books? I mean, that at least a couple in that, wasn't there?
Well, I'm working on a sequel to The Moon in the Desert. It's called The Sands of Mars. It's about 3/4 written. And I use dictation, and then I go back and have to do an awful lot of editing after the dictation. I've gotten a few new tools to assist with that. But I had to take a break and finish the zombie apocalypse novel, Across an Ocean of Stars. And now I'm back to finishing Sands of Mars. After that, I'm not quite certain, but there's a funny one that I owe my readers and fans, in which I basically am writing the story of a scientist who has to go to the equivalent of Hogwarts and teach a class. And of course, he doesn't believe in magic. So it's kind of fun. I'm working on that one after.
Okay. Is this you doing this for Bain, or are you doing this for somebody else, or are you just
right now I'm writing it for me, and we'll see how it goes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we'll find somebody.
We'll find somebody that likes
I'm
it.
sure.
Yeah.
You have enough of a reputation that I think it'll.
I think I could find some
you know.
publishers here too.
Yeah, I mean, Law
Oh, he
Dog
stuck
step
his
back
head in,
out.
just,
Yeah.
yeah.
That's because that's right up Raconteur Press's alley. But
Yeah.
anyway, so after the break, we're going to think about what you want to ask Robert, because we're going to let him answer some questions. Also, give him the chance to tell him. Don't have enough time right now, but tell us about how he's transitioned in his scientific career, because that was a big deal a year ago.
It was. It was a very big deal.
So after the break, I'll be back. We'll finish up, take some questions from the audience, and Robert will tell us about his second career as a scientist. I'm Fred Hughes, and this is The Next Chapter. And we're back with Dr. Robert Hampson. So, your scientific transition that's happened within the last year. Let's talk a little bit about that.
I got to a point in my research career where I've been at this for 42 years. Since my PhD, it's been 36 years. And there hits a point where you don't want to go after grants. I mean, the life of an academic researcher is pursuing grants, getting the funding, running the experiments, writing the papers, and worrying about your next funding, and trying to figure out how to keep everybody employed and all of the experiments running. I got to a point where most of what I had been doing was running out. And I was frankly ready to retire. Now, I like teaching, and what has happened over the last 6 or 7 years is I'm doing a lot more teaching than I used to early in my career. So I was ready to make a transition. I thought maybe I would just retire and just stay on the bare minimum to teach. I got an offer I couldn't refuse from an institute that needed a senior professor who could do some mentoring of students, as well as provide some consulting on projects. I'm now in a tissue engineering institute. And again, as I said, I do a lot. I teach and I consult, which is kind of what I would have done if I had retired. But instead of working on neurotechnology, where we would put a thingy in the brainy, we're now working on engineering tissue to do brain-like things. So I'm building a brainy on the thingy. And by the way, for anybody at Pecan, I will have those badge ribbons later. But it's a neat transition because there are projects. I mean, bionics is great. Bionics is wonderful, and it inspired me. And yet, even that way, along the way, there were projects I thought were really cool, and I wish I could be involved in. And it's tissue engineering. Can we culture neurons in a dish that has electrodes built into it and get that to do brain-like things? Maybe not much. I think right now the current state of the art is they've got one that can play Pong. And we're working on a couple of things, because the implications are, if we can do this in the dish, maybe we can come up with a way to for a treatment for Alzheimer's and stroke, head injury, and the like, with a tissue engineering. But I didn't have the technology. I didn't have the technique. I didn't have the training in this area. This is what the Institute does. And I don't have to do it myself. There are people doing this, but they need the neuroscientist perspective. They need the physiologist perspective. And I'm able to do that. It's a lot of fun. And it's very rewarding.
So you got to have your cake and eat it too.
I suppose I did, yes.
So, got time for a couple of questions? Go ahead.
All right, Rob. So, knowing how vastly knowledgeable you are in the neuroscience and physiology fields, how did you go about, quote, dumbing it down for your readers so that it's, if not realistic, believable?
Because So the question, in case it didn't come across clear, is how do I take the sophisticated technological terminology and knowledge and make it readable, understandable, enjoyable by an audience? And the answer to that is it's not dumbing down, it's explaining. So I try to find analogies. So if we're talking about how a neuron works, I could use an analogy of plumbing. I could use an analogy of clockwork. I can use an analogy of electricity and electronics. Part of this is from the teaching aspects and being able to create analogies. And what I find that seems to work really well is don't leave the technology out, but just make
Yes.
sure that I explain it. And it also goes back to the old Star Trek principle, show it in use. So Star Trek never explained what a phaser was. They just showed it in use. With the bionics in the moon and the desert, it's much more important for me to show it in use. And I might have the character comment on it rather than spend a lot of time in an info dump explaining it.
Yeah, because readers will get, if they believe you're condescending, they'll get turned off in a hurry.
And that's the teacher in you. You're essentially a professional explainer. That's what teachers do.
I'm trying to teach students, the budding young researchers and scientists, that they need to explain and they need to reach out to the public and become communicators as well. We don't do it well as scientists in general.
A lot of people don't do it well. Go ahead.
You got me thinking with the thingy on the brainy about the idea of using, you've heard the trope of using metal implants to control things.
Right.
We talked a few years about that at Liberty Con, and you completely shot me down on something being workable. But the broader question is, if you're a writer and you're looking for things to incorporate in the story, the MacGuffin, basically.
Right.
Where are some good sources? And I know other than the internet, could you recommend anything that would be a good source to get out mind for ideas?
Actually, what I'll do is direct people to rehampson.com and look at some of the essays that I wrote that are nonfiction, but they're science for the science fiction audience. Other places to look is when there's used to be called PubMed Central, and I cannot remember what the name of it is now. PubMed.
No, I mean, isn't it called PubMark now? Because I know
No, it's not.
research, but I hit a paywall.
No, that's not the one. Look up.
Medline?
Pardon?
Medline?
It's called Medline Plus.
Okay.
It's Medline Plus. And Medline was the original database for scientific information. Medline Plus is a great place where you get the actual factual information, and you can use that to direct you. You can then go as far down the rabbit hole as you want, technical or not technical. You can find the foundations, you can find the public organizations, the advocacy organizations, and also technical documentation as well. It's a great way to get started with finding the information. Then the other thing is there are quite a few people who do science communication, and they're out there. You would basically look for science communicator.
Thank you.
All right. Well, that's it for the show. I want to thank Dr. Robert Hampson for being with me. We could have talked for another hour probably, but the show's called The Next Chapter. Find us on YouTube, Biz TV. I'm Fred Hughes. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Fred. I really appreciate you.